You. It's my great pleasure to be here today to share some of my personal interaction with certainly one of the most impressive mystics of the 20th century, Maria Esperanza. In 1997, I didn't know who Maria Esperanza was. I didn't even know she existed. I had never heard of Betania, the land where the apparitions of the Blessed Mother took place in the 1980s. Furthermore, I never heard of Divine Mercy either. You might say I was an ignorant Sunday Catholic. Like a lot of people, I must say, that I've come across over the years. It all changed in the summer of 1997. When I was sitting at work one day, I had a call from someone I never met before. And he introduced himself, and he said he had heard a lot about me and my company. And he said, would you like to have a business lunch to talk about what we might do together business-wise? So I said, sure. Why not? Sounded like an interesting thing. Well, his company was outside of Philadelphia, and mine was close to New York. So it was a bit of a distance, but I agreed to meet him. And on the day we chose, I drove down. It took about an hour and a half to get there. And I met him at this restaurant, and we went in and sat down. I spent about an hour and a half at lunch with him. And it was one of the most frustrating hour and a halves of my life, because he never said anything about business. He never asked me any personal questions. He never talked about my business. He never talked about his business. It was an incredible waste of time. So I had driven an hour and a half there. I sat there for an hour and a half, and I was looking forward to another hour and a half to get back. I was furious. I like to say because that was before I was a Franciscan, so it was okay to be aggravated. Anyway, I sat there, and I was fuming. And finally he said, well, thank you for coming. And I just shook my head. It seemed ridiculous, so aggravating. And as I was walking out of the restaurant, kind of shaking my head, thinking this guy's a nut, he put his arm around me. And I was totally offended. Because, you know, for one thing, as I used to tell my Italian wife, I'm not into that male bonding thing. But beyond that, I was just so angry at him, the last thing I wanted to do was hug him. Anyway, out of the blue, he said to me, have you ever heard of Betania, Venezuela? And I said, no. He said, well, have you heard of a woman? Her name is Maria Esperanza. I said, no. He said, well, Maria Esperanza is a very interesting woman. In fact, she had an apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Betania, Venezuela. But what's interesting about it is those apparitions have been approved by the Catholic Church. What do you think of that? I thought he was nuts. Totally nuts. But I didn't understand the question, so I thought about it for a second, and I didn't know what to say. So I said, well, if you're asking me, do I believe that a person can have an apparition? The answer is yes. I believe that. I believe in Fatima, and I believe in Lourdes. But if you're asking me whether I know if this woman, who I never heard of, had an apparition in this place I never heard of, how would I know? What are you asking me for? He said, well, Maria Esperanza is coming to the United States in a month. She's coming to speak at a conference at Notre Dame University. And she wants to meet you when she comes here. Would you be willing to meet her? I didn't know what to say. I'm not usually short on words. I was so dumbfounded, I said, well, I guess so. Now, this is the hard part to believe. I didn't ever look to see if there was a Maria Esperanza. I never went on the internet. I never spoke to anybody I know who would know these kinds of things, including priests or close friends of mine. I never did anything to pursue the knowledge that she was a real person. And sure enough, a month went by, and he called again. And he said, Maria Esperanza is in town. She's staying at the Short Hills Hilton Hotel, and she wants to see you on Thursday. I said, sure. Why not? So when Thursday came, I didn't hear anything. All day long, nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I thought by the end of the day, this guy is absolutely nuts. This imaginary woman and this crazy guy, this is nuts. Anyway, no word Thursday, no word Friday, no words Monday. Tuesday morning, the phone rings at 10 o'clock in the morning. And my business partner answered the phone. He come walking in with kind of a chuckle on his face. And he said, this guy Ron's on the phone. That was his name. So I picked up the phone. He said, oh, Paul, I'm really sorry. You know, Maria Esperanza had a problem with her heart, and she had to go to the hospital, and I was the only American there. And but don't worry, she's okay. I just sort of looked at the phone like, you gotta be kidding me. Anyway, I didn't really know what to say. And he said, but she left for Rome last night to see the Pope. And she'll be back in 10 days. And she definitely wants to see her when she comes back. So I said, okay, sure. And I hung up the phone. To me, it was the biggest joke going. In any case, I have to cut the short very, very short so I get the whole thing in. But in any case, 10 days later, sure enough, I had the chance to go and meet Maria Esperanza. Now, Maria, I still didn't really know she was real. There was something that held me back. I'm not usually that dull mentally. And normally I would look things up and find out who she was. But the whole thing was so wacky that it just didn't seem real to me. Anyway, I went there to the Short Hills Hilton. I was introduced to her. She said to me, I'd like to have lunch with you through an interpreter. First she said it to me in Spanish, and when I must have looked dumb, she must have realized I didn't speak Spanish. So they had to interpret. So in any case, we sat down, and she told us part of her life story, which was very moving, about her mystical experiences beginning at the age of 5. At that point, she looked at my business partner who tagged along because he was so interested in this story. And the strange thing about him is he's an atheist. So he was entirely intrigued with this whole thing. And she looked over him and she started to laugh. And she pointed her finger at him and said, you know, you're very smart, but you're very young. And then she started to laugh. And all the Spanish-speaking people started to laugh. And I thought to myself, what's so funny about that? You know? And then I thought about it for a minute. I realized that Carlos, her son-in-law, who was translating, made a translation mistake. That she didn't really use the word for young. She used the word for immature, which suits my partner perfectly. So then I got the joke. I started laughing. I told the English-speaking people at the table. They all started laughing. And we were all yucking it up, sitting at the table. At that point, Maria turned from one side of the table to the other to look straight at me. And this was really the first time she looked straight at me. And her eyes filled up with tears, and her face became very serious. And she pointed at me, and she said, today is a blessed day in your life. If you hadn't come here today, you would have died today. It's a good thing I didn't know that she was a real mystic. I would have had a heart attack right there. I still didn't believe her. There was still this reluctance that I had to believing in her. And then she began to describe all these things that were wrong with me physically. And it turns out that she was absolutely right. I had all these problems. I was suffering from angina. I had all these issues that were going wrong. And she said to me, I'm going to relieve you of that right now. And she put her hand out like this. And she moved her hand from left to right. And she said, it's taken care of. I didn't feel anything. I had no way to know whether what she did was real or not. So I didn't think about it very much. You know, I just said, well, okay. What are you going to say? So then she said, whenever you pray, do you pray to the Sacred Heart of Jesus? And I said, no, I don't. I said, I know what the Sacred Heart of Jesus is, but I don't pray to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So she said to me, well, from now on, whenever you pray, I want you to pray to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, because if you do, our Lord will give you whatever you ask of him. I was pretty impressed. I thought, well, I'll pray for something. And if I get it, maybe I could believe in her or something. In any case, then she looked at me in a rather strange way, and she started looking sort of over my head, and her eyes filled up with tears. And she kept looking and squinting, and she said, I see a tall spirit standing behind you. It's a man, and he has white hair. And I'm thinking to myself, great. We're going to have a seance in the middle of the Short Hills Hilton dining room. This is unbelievable. So she goes on, and she's telling me about this guy and all not only the physical traits, but the psychological traits and all these things. After a few minutes, I realized she's describing my dead father. I was shocked. It was at that point I started to get serious about believing that maybe there was something here I didn't really understand. As she went on, her son-in-law was translating, said Saint Joseph, and and she said, no, not Saint Joseph, meaning the name was Joseph, but it wasn't the Saint Joseph she was talking about. And of course, you can guess by now that my father's name was Joseph. So I was quite touched, and I was getting very emotional, But at that moment, I decided I would look over at my atheist partner who knew my father. And I thought, well, I wonder if he knows what she's talking about. And I turned my head, and his face was white. His eyes were gigantic, and he was crying, and he had lost control of the muscles of his face. His face was actually, the muscles were moving. And he leaned forward and he said, Paul, I see Joe standing behind you. Well, needless to say, that began Kurt's conversion. 4 years later, Kurt became a Catholic. During the next 3 hours, I was healed not only of the problem with my heart, but in 1971, I was disabled when I was in the Army. I was healed of that. My mother, who wasn't even there, who couldn't walk for 6 months, was healed because she saw it. And at the end of all that, I had no idea where all this was going. But I was really freaking out, to say the least. And at the end, she said, Paul, you have tremendous faith. And our Lord has prepared you for this day. Because from this day forward, you're going to see things that other people can't see. And people will begin to follow you. She said, you're going to notice sometimes that you're in a group of people, and you'll turn your head and you'll see people staring at you as if you're handsome. That always gets me. But she said it's not that they're looking at you, because they're not going to see you. They're going to see Jesus himself, because you're going to become an apostle of Christ, and you're going to save thousands of souls. And she got up and left. Imagine, that was my first 5 hours with Maria Esperanza. I spent over 10 years with her before she passed away, and experienced so many incredible mystical charisms that she had. I was in her presence, both in her home and traveling with her, and her in my home. She became my mother, not just from a spiritual standpoint, but she always said to me, even though she had 7 children, she said to me, you're not just my spiritual son, you are my son, which was a very wonderful and beautiful thing to experience. The first time I traveled with her, I was in New Mexico, and we were driving from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, and we were in this van, and this woman said, let's pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet. I didn't know what it was. And so she prayed it, and she said, you'll figure it out as you go along, and we prayed it together. And it was a beautiful, beautiful expression, I thought, of the mercy of God. And so I began to pray it. And in fact, the first time I came back after about 2 months after meeting Maria Esperanza, for the first time in my life, someone asked me to pray for them. It was a 35-year-old woman who had a brain tumor, inoperable brain tumor, 2 small children. She was dying. And she just asked me to pray. And that, of course, made an impression on me because I hadn't told this story to anyone. I only told it to my mother and my wife. Not even my children heard the story. So I wasn't spreading it around. And so that night I began to pray, and I fell asleep. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up with real terrible pains and all kinds of things that woke me out of a dead sleep. I got up, and the room was pitch black, and I sat in the chair next to our bed, and I decided to pray the Divine Mercy for this woman. So I took my rosary beads in my 2 hands, and I started to move from bead to bead. And as I was praying, I was looking down at my hands, and it was pitch black, when all of a sudden in the room, my hands were lit by the rays of Divine Mercy. The woman was spontaneously healed that next day. It was the first time that I ever prayed for someone, and a miracle occurred as a result of it. And of course, that impressed me greatly. And it began for the next 3 years, despite the fact that I never told anyone the story. I never gave anybody my telephone number. I never spoke in public. I didn't have a website. I had nothing. Over 3,000 people throughout all the world found me and asked me to pray for them. And there were many miracles. One of those miracles following these 3 years was I was requested to go to Newark, New Jersey, to visit this abandoned church because there were people there that needed prayer, people from the street. And I went there, and that day I walked in, and I'm embarrassed to say this to you, but I feel the necessity to tell you the truth. When I walked into this church, I heard a message similar to what St. Francis heard, to rebirth the church. And I was privileged with a vision, not a vision of my sight, but a vision in my brain of what the future of this church would be. One of those things was the establishment of Divine Mercy, a shrine for Divine Mercy, in Newark, in the most difficult, dangerous place in the city. Last year alone, there were 6 murders on our corner. In any case, when I spoke to the bishop, he agreed miraculously, because both of these places were supposed to be sold. And today, we have the New Jersey Center for Divine Mercy in Newark, and it is growing, and there are many, many miracles that have come there. And as a post